Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this sixth webinar for journalists organized by Panelfit. And today we are addressing a very hot topic, at least in the last year and a half. So that is health data and data protection. So of course, we all know that health by definition involves personal data and spatial categories of data. So it is particularly challenging for journalists to deal with these topics without infringing laws and other guidelines and professional rules and practices. So it's very, very important today to know how to deal with these topics. And Iñigo de Miguel, who is the senior researcher at the University of Basque Country, will give us an overview of the European legal framework, but also some practical topics and interesting takeaways that can be helpful for journalists and also for researchers, because I see that among our audience there are a lot of researchers as well. So good afternoon, Iñigo.
Hey, good afternoon, Federico. I think that you could all hear me well and see me. Thank you everyone for being here. It's my pleasure to share this time with you. Well, I will just try to give you some initial ideas, mainly that I will just try to address how especially journalists should use data in pandemics. And but of course, most of the things that I will tell journalists will share the same for those who are not. There will be some exceptions, but in general, that's more or less what we have. And I will really try to be brief, so as we could have some time for a debate or for, I mean, if any of you is willing to make some questions, even not really in the topic as I'm addressing it right now, but maybe you could go a little bit out of topic. That's good for me. We have time to discuss about more or less everything. To make you some examples, I will not be addressing, for example, data protection issues related to immunity certificates, even though this is very interesting for any of us. We already addressed that in a former encounter, in one of these encounters online. So you have it recorded, and if someone is interested in that, you could always take a look at that. It's in our web page. But anyway, if any of you is willing to come back to any of these topics, we could do that during the debate. So I will just start with the kind of messages, the issues, the main point I would like to address today, and then we could go wherever you want on the debate. Okay, so let's start with that. Well, some key points that are essential to me. Well, in Panelfit, we decided to put our focus on journalists due to a very simple reasons. Journalists are very important people, even if we don't. Sometimes doesn't seem that we consider them such. But the point is that in general, journalists are considered to be somehow the ones that are responsible for providing us with very good information. It's true that in terms of pandemics, governments are supposed to provide us with excellent information, but we all know that this is not always the case. So somehow journalists are the ones that should help us reach into this kind of essential information. I dare say that in these days, the role of professional journalists is even more important than in any other time in history. And this is due to a very simple fact. These days, we got all access to lots and lots of information. This is especially due to this impressive phenomenon of these social networks. We can, these days, we can get into lots of information through social networks, but also through internet. But essentially, lots of us get information from Twitter or from Facebook or for anything like that. Main problem is that some of this information is not information, but disinformation if it is not misinformation directly. So the the point is that I think that journalists are what really could be essential is that journalists help us providing nice information that has been elaborated in a way that is really reliable to us. This is difficult to do, and journalists are essential to that. Main problem with this is that sometimes, or very often, journalists are not so familiar with data protection issues, and data protection issues are quite important when we are dealing with situations such as pandemics. We must all consider that pandemics involves a lot of information, and a lot of that information is related to health data, and health data are usually personal data, and they are data that belongs to a special categories of a special data indeed. So main problem is that journalists, as everyone else in this world, cannot really process personal data if they don't have a legal basis that allows them to proceed. Moreover, if we are talking about health data, then we are talking about the special categories of personal data. And so there's a general veto to their processing, and that journalists need to find a way to try to avoid this veto. And there's also something very important, I dare say essential. In these days, we got something like, the terrible apple in paradise. That is that you got an extremely nice apple and you are willing to buy it if you are a journalist. And it's very difficult to avoid that. I'm thinking especially with those data that people quite often make public in social networks. If you're a journalist and see lots of people publishing in their, for example, Facebook profiles, this or that, well, it's an impressive temptation to go there and say, well, I can check this data because those are there and I will use them. Unfortunately, things don't work this way. And I will try to tell you right now, right now, that the availability of data does not really involve the levelness of processing. I will come back to this idea, but just to give you a first tip, people usually share their data for a concrete purpose. This doesn't mean that you can use those data for different purposes, just for the mere fact that you can see that. So that's something that you always have to keep in mind, because that's one of the great mistakes that sometimes we will really commit while working with personal data. So I will just start with the very first things. So the main problem that we have, or the first issue that we really need to focus on, is that health data belong to special categories of personal data according to Article 9.1 of the GDPR, meaning that in general, all the processing of personal data revealing racial and origin, etc., including health data, are prohibited. Indeed, shall be prohibited states. So in general, there's a veto, and nobody can process this type of data. Of course, I'm always thinking about personal data. I mean, there's nothing against processing non-personal data. Main problem is that sometimes it's not so easy to distinguish what is a personal data and what is not. In principle, personal data is the type of data that provides information about identified or identifiable person, meaning that someone that you could really know who he is or she is. And I will try to give you an example. For example, when you consider that you are providing data about who is suffering COVID in a concrete population, you might think, for example, that it's enough without mentioning the name to consider that these are not personal data. You can say, for example, there are 10 people in this hospital in, let's say, for example, in the Tuscany, okay? And of those 10 people, only 2 of them were vaccinated. And you will say, wow, so that's good. That's important information, and this is anonymized because nobody knows that. Main problem is that consider that you are dealing with a small village, for example, and you say there's only 10 people in a hospital, let's say, I don't know, in Viareggio or anything like that. I don't know if it is so small, but Federico could probably correct me. But if there are 10 people there and in their intensive care, and you say only 2 of them were not vaccinated, it could be very easy for the population in this village to guess who could be those ones. So some kind of information that in theory is not really personal data, because you're not mentioning nothing that really could serve, in practice is very easy to, to, to be understood as really real personal information. So you really need to make sure whether it is really that you are revealing or not personal data. If you consider that this personal data might be involved, then you really need to have a kind of, or find a kind of reason to to process those special categories of data. So the exceptions that are applicable in general to these are more or less the explicit content of the subject. Okay, those ones who really, you know, are the data subjects, the ones that are linked to those data that really allow you to do that. Something that sometimes happens, but sometimes it does not happen. Okay, so you should not be so confident on anything like that, especially because informed consent means something like free, voluntary consent, informed consent, lots of different things. When we are talking about people who is suffering from a kind of disease, for example, it's not so easy to consider that this consent is really worked well with the conditions that we have. Some other conditions that those data are manifestly made public by the data subject. For example, if someone is recording himself, herself in a room in a hospital, like, you know, saying, hello, I'm here and I'm suffering from this, and post that in a kind of social network, in principle, it's like a kind of, you know, a personal data that has been made public by the data subject. And then you get the most common reason or exemption why you can process those data, which is that processing is necessary for reasons of substantial public interest on the basis of union member states, which shall be proportionate to their pursuit, respect the sense of the right to data protection, and provide for suitable and specific measures to safeguard the fundamental rights and the interest of the data subjects. I will try to explain this quite briefly. You could process those data if you consider that they're of public interest. But even though you consider that, you should always try to do your best to not to cause any kind of unnecessary harm to the data protection subject and their fundamental rights, such as, for example, privacy and so on. So the idea is that even though you are processing those data, you should introduce a lot of different safeguards and so on, and you should tell the data subject about the rights and so on. So that's the type of things that you should do. And further, you should always keep in mind that your member states could introduce further conditions, including limitations with regard to processing of genetic, biometric, or health data. So it might happen that in your concrete member states, there are some different rules on this. Once you get it, you have not ended with the process. I'm so sorry. Because if you manage to have one of these conditions, you will only be able to avoid the veto. But this doesn't mean that you can go on with the processing. You need a legal basis according to Article 6 of the GDPR. So there are three promising legal bases that you can use. One is consent, again. The other one is the performance of a task carried out in public interest. And the other one is the legitimate interest. That is not so well known, but legitimate interest more or less is something like the controller, in this case, the journalist or the media in which they work, have an interest in processing this information due to, you know, it's a kind of legitimate interest. So they have to perform a kind of balancing test, and in this way, they could more or less compare their interest in publishing the information with the interest of the data subject in avoiding that. So that's more or less what they have to do. In general, it's not so different. I mean, the idea of public interest and the idea of legitimate interest in the case of journalists, in my honest opinion. However, you can find much more information about that in our handbook for journalists that is being produced by the Panelfit project, by the way, and will be ready and available very soon. Federico will correct me if this is not the case, but we will have it very soon available to all of you. So that could be very helpful for you in the next months or even years of your life. So if you are dedicated to that. So once you get this, in principle, you can start processing data. I dare give you some essential tips and maybe some kind of advice that could be helpful. Well, first of all, you must check what's going on with your national legal framework if you are a journalist, because there's something that is called the journalist exception, according to Article 85 of the GDPR. This exception means that the rights and the principles that usually apply to any applicable to the type of processing that you are performing because you are a journalist. So you got to make sure how this has been has been regulated in your own country to see what you can do and what you are obliged to. Because in principle, there are a lot of things you got to do according to the GDPR, but there could be a lot of exceptions on that. Okay, so just take a look at that. It will depend on your member state. And then I dare give you some kind of, let's see, takeaway points that might be, that I think that you should always keep in mind, that are also included in our handbook for journalists, okay? First is that you should always balance the interests at the stake. So, because information is very important, but you should always make sure that you are not causing a dramatic harm to the people who are involved. For example, it's very controversial if you are just showing images of people who is very sick, showing who they are and how they feel. Just think, for example, that maybe some of the relatives don't even know about that. It's the first time that they see them. So if it is not strictly necessary, you should always try to avoid any kind of personal information that might cause some harm to those ones who are the subjects or to the relatives. You should always consider whether it is really necessary in terms of information, in terms of informing the public about what's going on. There are lots of controversial images about that have been published in the last year. So there's a kind of, huge debate on that, but we have also some answers to that. And in general, it always brings you to the same point. Don't publish information if it is not, or some kind of personal data if it is not necessary for the type of information that you want to produce or give to the people. If you got doubts, you should always consider two things. One is that you should follow more or less the policies in the media you work for. Usually, most of them should have a kind of internal code of conduct that you should consider. Sometimes they got like a kind of legal department, and you should take a look at that. If this is, if it is available, it will always help you. And of course, try to find some intervention from senior editorials or anything like that if you are in doubt. Of course, if you're a freelance, this is much more difficult because you don't have that kind of support. It's much more difficult to give you a good advice on that. My advice will be that you should try at least to have some kind of informal help if you cannot achieve any other thing. I guess that in general, intuition serves quite well. And in case of doubt, I dare tell you, you should better not publish something that might cause a huge harm to someone else. You should always think, for example, that if you get some very excellent images, but some other people seems to have the same images and they are not being published, maybe there's a good reason why they are not being published. So you should always take a look at that and consider what's going on. So I dare tell you also that there might be some very information that could be, that are, say, much appreciated by the audience, but it's not relevant to the kind of research that you are doing. So for example, if you are finding that you get a kind of public officer that is doing a terrible work in terms of, I don't know, managing pandemics, and you start just, taking a look at that just to find out whether this kind of disasters management is because he's not so, or she's not so good on that, or maybe it's just quite corrupt some way or anything like that. And you, for example, discover that more than that, he's having a kind of, I don't know, a sexual affair that is totally distracting them or so. You should balance whether this makes a sense to publish that or not. If this could be the cause of this misfunctioning, of course you could. But if it's not related at all, then you should not really publish that just because that will give you a lot of, just for clickbait ideas or anything like that. You should not, give the audience some kind of information that is not really relevant for what is at the stake, but will be good in, somehow feeding the monster of this kind of public attraction that we all feel about some, concrete details about the people. So you always have to balance whether this information is really relevant or not. Also, it might happen, for example, that if you are in doubt, you could consider asking the supervisory authority in your country. That's something that it's, in theory, it's possible. In practice, it doesn't always work the same in all countries. And some other things that might be interesting: keep special care when you are thinking about very, very sensitive personal data, such as sexual orientation or religion or philosophical beliefs or anything like that, because this really has to do with the essential of the people. For example, in the case of COVID, one of the things that is usually there, and it's a huge temptation, is whether we are publishing this, if someone is vaccinated or not. This is key, and but we should always consider that this is might be considered not only as a health data, but could also be considered as a kind of ideological data somehow. So it's difficult to tell you that you could publish that if this is not really relevant and extremely relevant for the type of information that you are trying to give. So this is quite important. It's very important, because I often see, for example, that someone who is a famous man or woman is in intensive care, and somehow it's told something like he or she was not vaccinated. And my point is always like, but what is the type of information that you are trying to provide here? What are you telling about that? I mean, what's the real point that you want to do? If you want to translate something like vaccinating is important in terms of healthcare, you don't really have to point into this famous personal one. You should just take some, aggregated data to convince the audience that vaccination is really working well. So it's not so. But if you want to make him or her a kind of, symbol or icon on why you should vaccinate, maybe it will be good to have him consulted or anything like that. So that's my real opinion. And it's not so easy to say, well, since I know this data, I can just, tell that, if you don't have a really nice and important reason to do that. And it happens the same especially with vulnerable population. I often think in this case about children, and you should always take a special care with children. This will be very important in the next months, I'm pretty sure, due to a very simple reason. Children will be the only ones unvaccinated in the next months, especially children under 12 years. So it will be a huge temptation, to think and to give some information about the type of health conditions of children that are, in hospitals or anything like that, or the type of information about whether they are vaccinated or not, if we are talking about teenagers or anything like that. So you will feel a huge temptation in giving information. And it's good to tell you that this information might be key, and it's good to know that it's essential that maybe we don't need to have, kind of personal data involved. You don't need to say this concrete child is suffering this kind of process because he or she had this concrete previous health condition. This is not really needed, in my honest opinion. And I dare tell you that if it is not needed, you should not process that kind of information. So it's totally different than saying that it's good for the population. And in my opinion, it's a good idea to help us understand whether, for example, a COVID works the same or develops in the same way in healthy population or in population suffering some kind of concrete conditions. This is important in terms of understanding how it works and to make decisions, for example, about vaccinating young children. But it's totally different than the idea of we are giving personal data about this concrete child. Those are different things, okay? So whenever you can avoid giving information about some concrete child, you should always do that. And then a hot issue, just to end up with my initial presentation, okay? Journalists, as I was telling before, take data from social networks. And this is problematic because the mere fact that they are there doesn't mean, as I was telling before, that those people um, are really giving consent to all kind of processing. It's not that they are unveiling some of their opinions or whatever for any kind of purpose or use of those data. So whenever you are willing to use those data, first you gotta make sure if those are really public data or not. Meaning that, for example, if you get to get into some kind of community and then you get access to those data, those are not really public data. Those are data that are common to a kind of community. It doesn't mean that those ones who are publishing those data want those data to go outside that community, for example. It might be a very extensive community, but it's a community, okay? So you must keep that in mind. My second tip is that always take a look up to the kind of terms of use provided by each social media site, because in this way you will understand what people are really consenting when they are, getting access to those social media. Because most probably the terms of use of Twitter, the Twitter rules, and the terms of use in Facebook and the terms of use in some other social networks will be different. So you really need to understand what is what people are doing when they are giving data to these kind of sites. And moreover, it's also important that you just, if you get doubts, but I in general would recommend you that if you are willing, for example, to take huge amounts of data from this kind of social media, you start by contacting them, not just vampirizing somehow this data, but just get in touch with them. Probably most of them have some policies regarding sharing data with third parties, and they could help you understanding how it works. I dare tell you that most of the times they will probably ask you for a kind of a fee or anything like that to share data. I'm pretty sure about that. But I think that you should be aware that if you are not following the rules, most probably you will not have a legal basis for processing those data. And on the other hand, you shouldn't relax too much, considering that if a social media is giving you permission, or you think that somehow they are providing you with those data, you can use those data in the way you want. The idea that you need a legal basis for a kind of processing remains the same. So you really need to know what you are allowed to do with those data. For example, if Facebook or any other social networks obtain those data on the basis of a consent by the user of the network, you need to know what is the extension of this consent, because it might happen that, for example, the user is agrees on providing this information for commercial purposes, but it's not the same that revealing this information for some other purposes. So you need to make sure on what can be done from those data. And I think that this is enough for a kind of preliminary exposition, Federico. I've been talking like in about half an hour, so I think that's enough with Theo and me. I just wanted to highlight that there will be lots of information about all these issues provided by Panelfit project. We will have the handbook for journalists that will be available, and maybe Federico, you could provide for the details right now, but we will also have the general guidelines created by Panelfit that will be soon available. This will be a very interactive tool providing lots of information with that we will probably will serve you well to solve all of your doubts. And there will be a concrete part of the guidelines that might be very useful for you that will be related to the use of data created by social networks. And this will be produced, and I think that he's with us here with Jose Castillo and me, myself. I think that I saw before Jose Castillo somewhere in there. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think he was there. And yeah, he's Jose. Hi, Jose. Good to see you. Here you can see Jose Antonio Castillo Parrilla, who is the co-author together with me with this part of the guidelines related to social networks. So I guess that Jose Antonio could also answer some of your questions if they are related to those parts. But anyway, I just wanted to introduce to you one of the, the authors of the crime, if I dare say so. So that's all from my part, Federico. I hope that this was a quite, relaxed presentation, but attractive somehow. So Federico, The floor is yours if you want to send some other tips or give some other information to the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Iñigo, as always, for your presentations. It was interesting and full of hints. I put in the chat the link to Panelfit website. So as you said, in the coming weeks, the handbook for journalists will be uploaded there in different languages. So it is now in the process of translation. So it will be published there in a dedicated section. So since we're here, first of all, I encourage our audience to ask questions. Feel free to type them in the chat or to use the reaction button of Zoom to raise your hand, and we'll leave you the floor. I see some among the names of people here that there is someone who deals particularly with health issues in a journalistic way. So it will be interesting to have some questions here about this topic. And since we're here, I also would like to promote these 3 days conferences that we are organizing, always in the scope of Panelfit. Again, it's a program targeted to journalists. It will be held in October online, unfortunately. But yeah, we'll have 3 days with 3 topics. Iñigo mentioned before the topic of vulnerable populations. So we'll have a whole day dedicated to that, and also on cybersecurity and like big tech lobbying and the issue of regulations in the European framework on these topics. So actually, that's all from my side. So I really encourage our audience to raise their hand and ask their questions.
While they're asking questions, I dare say if there are some journalists here, something that could be interesting for the future, not really so related with data protection, but maybe, yes, maybe it will be. Something that will be quite nice in the next months is that somehow our societies will live on a new process. That would be a quite interesting process, in the sense that we will probably come back to normality. Well, to the normality that we had, not really normality, but some kind, common life. And that will be quite interesting due to a very simple reason. Those ones who will not be vaccinated or who will not be immune, in the sense that I'm thinking of those people who will not be able to get vaccinated, those people who will get vaccinated but not successfully, that there will be some people that will not be successfully vaccinated. And those people who will really opt out from vaccination will be some kind of new minority in the future, in the sense that there will be a percent of the population that, that will be somehow suffering a kind of limitation to the things that they can do. Just to give you an example, if you come back to normal life and you want to take a bus, for example, between 2 different cities, let's think that you want to travel from Roma to Firenze, and we come back to normality. Well, all those people who are suffering from a lack of defenses against the virus, well, they are playing an impressive risk when they take one of these buses. So thinking something that really counts on, it's very interesting for journalists in the future is, for example, how are we going to deal with these new situations? Should those people reveal their situations to gain a kind of, new and kind of help, a new kind of, special measures by the rest of us? Or how are we going to deal with that? This is a totally new open future that now it's starting to show the face. To make you a good example, Federico, now in Italy, I think that you are living with immunity certificates, more or less, yeah. The point is that at this moment, it seems that seems to be quite discriminative somehow with the people who are not vaccinated and so on. I think that we will see how useful they were for precisely those people, the day that they will all disappear, and you will never know who is near to you, and there are no masks, there's nothing at all in this world. So that will be a pretty nice day that we will see. I think that in like 2 or 3 months, we will see. In that moment, there will be lots of Italians protesting for the same reasons that they were protesting right now, by taking the totally opposite dimension of that. So just a bet, Federico, we will see that.
Yeah, we'll see. I can say that people who are not getting vaccinated for a deliberate choice are already depicting themselves as a discriminated minority, and this is I'm not sure it is the right way of seeing it, but yeah, we'll see. I mean, I wouldn't delve too much into these issues because they are changing on a daily basis. And maybe, I don't know, in 3 months we won't think anymore about all this certificate issue. And I mean, just look at what's happening in Denmark, where they had a certificate for some months, and now they lifted mostly all the restrictions. I mean, if you have a very high percentage of population vaccinated, the topic of people not being protected becomes somehow negligible. I mean, because the others are protecting them somehow. So, and this is how vaccines more or less work.
You are more optimistic than me, Federico. But I see Alexis a question. Hi, Alexis. I will try to answer your question, because Alexis is asking in the chat whether, because public interest seems an impressive legal basis to process data in journalists, and he's right. I mean, it's quite difficult to know what public interest means in terms of why it's so important, especially because not all. I mean, it's not the same that curiosity, for example. Lots of people feel curiosity for a lot of different types of information, but it doesn't mean that this information is of public interest. So sometimes it's difficult to trace this difference, but lots of us, for example, might be very interested on the let's say the sexual customs or habits or the orientation of some people. This doesn't mean that this is of public interest. That's one of the things that we need to keep in mind. So the point is whether some information is really relevant from a kind of legitimate public interest. This is something that we always have to keep in mind. The boundaries are not so clear in any way. And there are a lot of jurisprudence in lots of countries, more or less trying to trace a kind of boundary about what is a legitimate public interest or not. I remember, for example, there were a lot of sentences related to the case of Hanover and the Hanover family. Maybe you remember Ernesto of Hanover, who was the husband of Princess Carolina in Monaco. And there were lots of information about them when they were married. They were very popular. And there are some kind of sentences that they were, of rulings that they were just trying to settle the boundaries, even with such kind of very public people. And for example, there were some sentences that were saying that the type of activities performed by them could be of public interest, but information about their children was not of public interest. So there are some kind of, we have some kind of let's say, cases and historical precedents of what could be acceptable in terms of public interest and what will not, what should not be considered as such. We have somehow the jurisprudence by the Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, and then we have also the jurisprudence in each member states, because this could be different in each member states. But of course, it's totally true that in principle, it's hard to distinguish what might be of public interest and what is not. So there's an alternative legal basis in that sense, which is that the one of legitimate purpose. And you could say, for example, that you are processing those data because it's a legitimate interest of your mass media, processing that, but then you should perform a kind of balancing test and then put on one side of the balance this supposed public interest, and on the other side, just not the public interest, but the interest of your mass media, and the other part, the interest, the rights and freedoms of those data subjects involved. And then you should give very good reasons to consider whether the part of the balance that relates to your legitimate interest is really weighs more than the other side. So that's something that you could always do, and at least you should document that and give good reasons why you are thinking that the balancing test goes to one side and not to the other. But of course, and this is my criticism personally, it's very difficult to be objective in that. So it's very difficult for you to know to to arrive into such consideration. So sometimes I even recommend to have a third party that is really being part of that. But that's I cannot tell you some many more things. Maybe Jose Antonio could say something more, because I think that he's really looking forward to adding something or participating or whatever. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, Jose, feel free if you want to unmute
Just
yourself.
looking for the microphone. First of all, thank you, Iñigo, for the kind presentation and the good and enriching work together. I only wanted to add regarding the public interest that I agree with you, of course, with the difficulties in determining what's the public interest in each case. But if I had to add something, I would try to highlight that a public interest regarding journalism should be differentiated with news that deserve to be published. Public interest should not be mixed with information that deserves to be published. Is something more related to the public interest of the state, some values that we as community want to follow, but not something so important that should deserve to be published. This could be a kind of guidance in that field. And just a quick question to Iñigo that is not related to the journalism issue, but with the apps and the certificates and all that stuff that Iñigo is an expert. I was wondering to what extent in time should we ask for COVID certificates? I mean, when we overlap when we overpass the pandemic, when the COVID is one of multiple and other illnesses, should we keep asking for those certificates or not?
Well, that's a nice question. I would like to know the answer, but in general, if I dare say so, you know that those certificates involve a lot of data processing. So one of the key principles is that these kind of special categories of data processing can only be justified if there's no other way to arrive into this kind of same result, you know. So in my honest opinion, here the idea of necessity is really important. So your question should be somehow reformulated to when will this necessity will end up. So the idea is what is first, you really need to know what is the real purpose of those immunity certificates to know whether they are needed for that purpose or not. At this present moment, immunity certificates are needed for two different reasons. One is trying to diminish the risk of transmission the virus, and the other one clearly is promoting vaccination. So at least one of them will disappear quite soon. If we arrive into some kind of 80% of people vaccinated, certificates are no longer needed. They will not serve as a kind of nuance for vaccination. So that's all, folks. It's enough. And the other thing that is the diminution of risk. I really think there will be a time when, and it will be quite soon. There will always be a kind of transmission of the virus. In this sense, I'm not really so convinced as Federico that there will be a time when we will get into some kind of collective immunity, and so I guess that we will have to live with that. And at that moment, I think it makes no sense to go on with that, trying to protect us all for something that really, I mean, will only be affecting a minority of the population in a serious way. So the idea is that, you know, when you make this kind of say, what is the objective? If the objective is zero risk, of course, we will need immunity certificates. We will need probably a kind of, you know, whatever can be thought in this world, because zero COVID would be impossible to reach. So, but if we are realistic and our politics in the future will be something like, let's try to avoid, for example, a collapse in the hospitals or anything like that. Well, those are not necessary for anything like that. If by any chance circumstances change, we could both go back into this. So I think that in general, we will have to take a look to the rates of hospitalization and the way that healthcare resources are being used, and the percent of vaccination. Once we arrive into a, you know, a quite, I don't know, 75% or anything like that of vaccinated people, once that we know that the hospitals are not in real risk of getting COVID, I don't think that will no longer make real sense in terms of something that is really, you know, a compulsory for the population, but they might remain something as a kind of tool that might be used. For example, if you have a restaurant and you say, yo, I want to create a kind of COVID-free restaurant only for my clients, and the way that I will do that is by introducing some this, and all those ones who are going to that restaurants are, you know, voluntarily showing that they have performed a test and they are free of COVID and so on. That's perfectly acceptable, in my opinion, because it will be based on initiatives and something that has to do with private citizens, and so we should not intervene on that. So that's more or less what I think. So I guess that they will disappear soon as a general phenomenon, but they might remain in the future for some kind of, you know, constructing some kind of precise secure spaces for some kind of people. That's all. That's my maybe a little bit complex answer for a kind of very complex question, I guess.
Yeah, Iñigo will put our predictions into sealed envelopes, and then we'll open them in spring. Let's see.
Yeah. Until this moment, I have been quite good in making predictions, Federico. Jose knows that, that you know that I was doing that. So, but I think that yes, in the springtime, Federico, probably no immunity certificates anywhere in this world. Maybe some of them in Italy. I don't know, because Italy somehow, you know, works in another way. I don't know. Maybe
we end up loving them so much that we want to use them anyway. No, I have a question that I mean, from a non-legal point of view, since I'm not a lawyer, on the issue of public interest, it was interesting what Jose said about the difference between, let's say, newsworthiness and public interest, because they can be confused if you're not dealing with these concepts on a daily basis. But I was asking also, like, the definition of what is public interest. I think it's can be problematic, because we have to define whether public means the state or the population of a country, for instance, because I mean, I am defending public interest, for instance, if I analyze data and I see that a country's policy, for instance, for about COVID-19 infections are not working and are so harming people of that same countries. But I mean, in that way, it's a bit hard to say if I am acting on the public interest, so on the population, or against the public interest, so the state. I don't know if it makes sense, and if you want to comment on this.
Maybe I would just try to put you an example, and then Jose could try to that. I remember, maybe you remember, Jose, one case that was related to Elsa Pataki. You know, Elsa Pataki is a quite famous Spanish actress, you know, and if I remember it well, that was the case that she was in a kind of a holiday with a kind of judge, and she went to a kind of quite hidden beach that could not be accessed by just like a judge, and she was feeling like she was alone in there and so on. So she get naked in that beach and so on. But there was someone, like, I don't know how, they were following her and they were checking pictures about that. So the main problem is that these pictures were probably of huge interest for a lot of parts of the population. I mean, if you make a referendum about that and say, do you want to see Elsa Pataki's nude pictures? Lots of people will say, yes, I want to. But this doesn't mean that this is a public interest in that. It only means that lots of people are looking forward to seeing Elsa Pataki nude. That is totally different. So in my opinion, we should distinguish what is a kind of legitimate public interest and what is affecting a real, something that is affecting us as a whole population and is really relevant to our rights and liberties. The case of Elsa Pataki is not at all relevant to our rights and freedoms. It's relevant to our curiosity. It's totally different, but it's not in the same level, So maybe Jose Antonio, you could have something about that. So the main problem is always the same. How can you distinguish that? It's very difficult to give general rules on that, in my opinion. But in the example that you are putting, whenever you are trying to give people some information about how the state works, about how public governance works, this will always be a kind of legitimate public interest. So that's something like that. And in this way, I think that this could always be, essential in the sense that it should always protect journalists. That's the key point. And the main issue that we are having these days is that sometimes we are using data protection regulation in order to introduce a new kind of censorship of a journalist. This is one of the issues that we have. And in some countries, such as, for example, Romania, if I'm not wrong, sometimes there's been a kind of torsion of this data protection regulation in order to even try to threat journalists so that they don't make public some kind of information. Once you receive something like that, Federico, is that you are in the right pace. Because if someone in the government are threatening you, it's because you have something that is really relevant in terms of public interest. Nobody's threatening you. Nobody but Elsa Pataki is threatening you, probably, if you are revealing some kind of images like that, because there's not a kind of public interest in that. So in my case, it's quite simple. You should not publish something like the images of Elsa Pataki, but you should, and we should all try to help you in publishing those kinds of information that provoke a threat by public authorities, something like that. So if you're afraid of public authorities, there's a public interest in that. So maybe, Jose, my example works well. I don't know if you got better examples.
I was thinking more or less in the same kind of example. To take the one that you shared, let's imagine that we know some secret affair or something so between public people. If those public people are Elsa Pataki and a football player, this can be news. This can be something interesting, and it deserves to be published. But this is not public interest. But if those public people are the president of one government and the president of the European Central Bank or something, so this is public interest. I wanted to add something that I was thinking while you were talking. That is, I think that is something good, that the public interest is an undefined concept. I would relate it with the values that stand the state as a community, the values that allow the state to be something strong to protect the community, such as democracy, privacy, fundamental rights. This could be related to public interest to protect this state. But I think it's quite good that we do not have a clear definition on that.
Yeah.
But,
and if I can have a final, a kind of final tip about that, Jose, on Federico. Sometimes, I mean, it might happen that you cannot process those data on the basis of public interest, but you could do that on the basis of legitimate interest. Because it might happen, for example, that you are one of those yellow papers, something like that, that is precisely publishing affairs between football players and stars or anything like that. But then it should not really be such like public interest. Maybe it should be just like kind of legitimate interest. That's your business that you are publishing this kind of news. Some people are buying this news, and you just have to balance, between the rights and the interest of those ones who are affected, and your legitimate interest as a kind of a company that lives on publishing this kind of news. So, I mean, the thing that you are referring to the conclusion that public interest does not apply doesn't mean that you can process those data or that you need to have the consent of those people. You get this other legal basis that is legitimate interest, and that's all. But in the case of, for example, something that we are addressing right now, that it's a kind of, pandemics or anything like that, I think that mainly public interest should be the real basis that you will need to use in order to provide this information. So I think that the context is always very important in order to choose one legal base or another one. So that's more or less what seems plausible to me.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for these insightful hints. It's almost 4 o'clock, so I guess that we can wrap up here. So thanks again, Iñigo, and thanks, Jose, also for your participation. And again, keep an eye to our website. I put the link in the chat. Reach out. You have my email, so anything you want, if you have questions, if you want the presentation that Iñigo shared, just drop me a line. And thanks a lot, and see you in the next Panelfit event.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.